Hello and welcome to the FinTech Power 50. On this episode of our webinar, we're going to be discussing all things partnerships. So alongside creating brilliant products and services, FinTechs, and indeed any business, need to focus on creating strong partnerships to help their businesses to scale and grow. Whether that's integrating new innovation, sourcing new leads, or identifying partners to lead your entry into new markets. A good partner is one of the key ingredients in making a FinTech successful. So in this webinar, we'll look at some of the recent headline-grabbing partnerships, discuss what makes for a good and fruitful partnership, and then look at ways a FinTech can sharpen their approach. So I'd like to now introduce you to our amazing guests, dare I say, starting with Darren Powell, the head of FinTech Business Development for MasterCard for their UK and Ireland business. Shayna Schneider, the Global Marketing Director for leading fraud FinTech at Silent8. And then Louis Demetroukoulis, who will pronounce his surname better than I will do shortly, who's the Strategic Partnerships Manager for leading FinTech TomatoPay. Hello, guests, and welcome to the webinar. So if we start with some introductions, perhaps starting with Darren.
Hey, Greg, pleasure to be with you. So as you mentioned, I lead the business development effort for MasterCard here in the UK with oversight for the UK and Ireland. But as one can imagine, when we talk partnerships, a big part of my role is to be a bit of a connector, signpost, a broker of capabilities, if you wish, and I and my team bring in the right people at the right time to add meaningful, credible value to conversations. Issuance is very much my sweet spot and that of the teams, but linked to what I've just said, it really is about understanding and discovering what our clients or prospective clients are looking for, and being able to layer in the right solutions and the right stakeholders at the right time to add that credible conversation.
Thanks, Darren. Shayna, over to the pond. A hello to you. It's a holiday as well, so we're doubly grateful for you coming along. We hope you've got lots of caffeine next to you.
Oh yes, it's coming.
Hello and welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and just thank you so much for having me, Greg. Really nice to be here. As Greg mentioned, I'm the Global Marketing Director for Silent8. We're a FinTech in the regulatory compliance space. I've personally been in the startup space for about 12 years across FinTech, AdTech, and EdTech. So kind of had my hands in a lot of different pots, but just this space especially right now, which I know we'll dive into later, is such an exciting one to be in, and I think made that much more interesting and just more compelling by some really great partnerships. So a large portion of what I do at Silent8 is look for opportunities, as a startup and a FinTech, for ways we can partner with other organizations that provide results that are mutually beneficial to both. So again, thank you for being here and excited to talk more about this.
Oh, thank you, Shayna. And then Louis from Canary Wharf via Chicago.
Thanks, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here as well. My name is Louis. I run our partnerships at TomatoPay, which is an open banking powered revenue collection tool, which uses QR codes to help small businesses get paid and pay. And we also have an invoicing solution. So our partnership strategy is fairly unique in the sense that we're an infrastructure player, but we're also a direct product to market strategy. So I'll be happy to kind of cover both of those today and how they differ in terms of who we look to partner with.
Oh, Louis, thank you. What you're doing is fascinating and highly innovative for a whole set of reasons. And we're looking forward to hearing more about it. Let's start with I suppose the existential question. What is a partnership, and what does it mean? What does it mean to you? Maybe Darren, you could kick us off.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question. It's something that sounds so obvious. I suppose at its most basic form, what is it? It's an engagement from like-minded entities that are keen to engage and to have a conversation to understand what the art of the possible may be. Now, from my perspective, to expand that a little further, I would argue that it's about understanding what are those values. Ideally, it's about understanding what are those shared values, being able to have extremely open lines of communication, being completely transparent so that there is no hidden agenda, because otherwise, how on earth are you putting the foundation in place of a partnership if ultimately you don't have full visibility straight off the bat? So I guess aligned to that point, it's important to acknowledge trust. And all of that is underpinned by just having that desire and receptivity to build on those conversations and at least nurture and agree that there's a relationship there to be nurtured and developed.
That definitely strikes a chord in terms of shared values. Shana, what's your take on that?
Yeah, that was a really beautiful answer. So I'm not going to elaborate too much from the definition that you gave, because I completely agree. I think especially, in the business world, the water starts to get a little muddy because people have, of course, business objectives. So I think what's key to a really good partnership is, as Darren mentioned, honesty, having the right people at the table, all the stakeholders in the room when we're talking about partnerships, and just being really candid with each other about what's working, what's not working, especially when something isn't working. So just having that honesty and kind of minimizing any power dynamics that can be intrinsic when you're in a boardroom versus a partnership outside of the business world, to me is the definition of a pure partnership in the business or fintech space.
Well, Shana, I'd love to follow up on that a little bit more with the power kind of dynamics from a gender point of view as well, but maybe that's what we can come on to later, because I know the FinTech Times is particularly passionate about diversity in fintech. Louis, what's your take on that? What's your definition of a partnership, and what makes for a good one?
Yeah, well, I have a little bit of a drier, more direct answer, but I would actually, I really see partnerships as a strategy, both for go-to-market and for scale. I mean, in our space, it's really critical to any kind of fintech startup success to build an ecosystem around them. That's going to help with network effects. That's going to help with getting the right kind of financial institutions on board to your vision and what you're doing, and getting buy-in from kind of industry incumbents, as well as other fintechs that you might partner with for distribution or other opportunities. So I really see it as something you can calculate a lot. You can work backwards, but then of course to the first two answers, it comes down to the people. It comes down to making sure that there is consistent alignment, and that everyone's kind of working together to create more value for both parties at the end of the day.
Thanks, Louis. That's not at all dry. I mean, creating common shared value, I think it has to be the bedrock of creating a strong partnership. Moving on now into a few examples. What have been some of the most high-profile partnerships in fintech over the last 12 months? And maybe we can start with Shana, because I know she's got a particularly headline-grabbing partnership that she's recently announced.
Yeah, so I'm excited to have this one to share, which I'm sure is public and quite well known by now, or I think so, especially within this audience. Silent8 signed a multi-year partnership with global bank HSBC at the beginning of 2021. To Louis' point about partnerships, the benefit for a smaller fintech, which we know we'll talk about later, or a startup, to kind of leverage the credibility of a bank that's so well known as HSBC has been invaluable for us. But this partnership came about to enhance some of their financial crime compliance offerings. And that, going back to what we've all said, is kind of the baseline of a good partnership. Is it's really underpinned by just fantastic relationships between their stakeholders and our CRO, and just having authentic and ongoing conversations all the time, even once the deal has been signed, about what's working and what's not. And so far, it's been a tremendously successful relationship with them. But to not be completely self-promotional, I'll also say I've been working with Silent8 has been working with Finder since they started. We've partnered with them to find other partners, and that has been a really successful relationship. And just more broadly as well, to even be, again, one step further removed from talking about Silent8 or myself. I think in the buy now, pay later space, there's a lot of really interesting partnerships going on. I know, Apple announced a partnership with Affirm back in August, I believe, and then Amazon is following suit, and there's several other vendors in that space that are really hot right now. So I'm kind of keeping my eye on that space, just because I think it's a really fascinating one and very representative of the world we live in today.
Oh, thank you, Shana. And just so our listeners are all clear, I did not ask Shana to mention that very kind shout out to Finder. So Louis, coming on to you. So where's your eye been taken to in terms of headline partnerships over the last 12 months?
Well, I think it's really interesting that Shana mentioned Silent8's partnership with HSBC, because I think one of the common challenges that we see in fintech is whether to partner or try and compete as a fintech. And that's kind of the big question. What do you actually do? What strategy do you take? And I think a lot of the major high-profile partnerships that we've seen over the last 12 months, I mean, particularly in open banking, are actually collaboration driven between the incumbent financial institution and the potentially disruptive fintech. And whether that's a move to stave off competition or to kind of embrace it in order to provide better products and services to end customers, I think it's a great trend, and I think it's going to continue to head in that direction. It's been a bumper year for M&A in the open banking space, and we're seeing kind of a little bit more consolidation. We just launched our flagship partnership with Santander in the UK, which is bringing a co-branded version of our application to their small business and business banking customers. And that's another example of both from the bank's perspective and from our point of view, collaborating to deliver a industry-leading product to small businesses seemed like a more natural path to go down in terms of partnering, rather than trying to kind of compete with different unique propositions. So I think there's lots of positive developments between the kind of incumbent fintech collaboration. Another one that I've seen that's kind of more outside of the fintech space is Funding Exchange just announced that they're embedding a lending marketplace onto eBay to help eBay sellers get quicker access to funds. And I think that's a great example from kind of the embedded finance space of a non-financial services player adding a kind of financial services proposition through a leading fintech. And I think those kind of partnerships we're going to see a lot more of over the next couple of years.
Thanks, Louis. That's, I guess, one of the main kind of big questions for partnerships: build it or buy it. But Shayna, maybe we could come back to you now, and just kind of building on that last question. Why do you think those partnerships that you just shared your thoughts on were needed, and how do you think they'll evolve? So perhaps with yours and HSBC, perhaps starting with that one.
Sure. I think, and it's interesting because I actually joined Silent8 in March of 2019, which, as everyone knows, is when, or 2020 rather, sorry, is when the pandemic, started to happen globally. And I think COVID has just changed the game for our space so much. I mean, I don't think it's changed the game in that things that weren't going to already happen are now happening. I just think it's increased the speed in which things have become, more automated. There's a reliance on digitalization. Everyone's moved online. So it's just created suddenly and quite urgently this new need to move things entirely online, work online, process payments online, and such. So I think that's a big part of why they were needed and why they are needed. I was just reading and kind of getting ready for this that the adoption rate of fintech services is expected to grow, I think, about 64% in the next couple of years into 2022. So I think with things suddenly now and the entire world being online, banks especially are recognizing a need that they don't have internally to find solutions. And there's plenty of them out there in the startup and fintech space. So I would say largely COVID has been a huge impetus in accelerating this growth.
No, thanks, Shane. I think we'd all agree that COVID has definitely had a significant, perhaps long-lasting impact on everything, really. I mean, Louis, maybe I could get your take on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the digital transformation brought on by COVID has really changed the partnerships game, and dare I say, actually made it a little bit easier to build partnerships. That's why platforms like Finder are great, because I think everyone's kind of seeing a need now to be on a central platform to unlock new opportunities. I think these partnerships were needed fundamentally because they begin to set a healthy precedent for future collaboration. I think there were, every time I open the kind of industry news, there's a new partnership being made, and it's kind of the fastest pace of partnerships being signed that I can remember. And I think that what that signals is people have stopped kind of in the time they stopped traveling and going all over the world. Now it's easier to just get on a phone call or a video conference and start to build a partnership. And I think that trend's going to continue, where we're going to see a little bit lower barrier to entry to start building some of these partnerships. And and really, continue to drive activity. So I think these partnerships that were really kind of blockbuster were needed because they set a good model for other companies to follow.
So following on from that, I guess from a MasterCard viewpoint, I'd encourage people to perhaps look to find what they see as a high profile or some of the more prolific partnerships. I mean, for me, it's important, one, to remain agnostic, but two, all of the partnerships that certainly I or wider MasterCard work with, they've all got such significant value on their own merits, right? So I think what I tend to look at is ultimately, and I'll err on the side of caution for now, but from a UK and Ireland perspective, MasterCard has 85% of the fintech market share, okay? So with that comes its own sort of upside, clearly, but also its own challenges in terms of protecting and growing that base. Because if we're able to, and this is testament to a lot of my predecessors who did an amazing job laying the groundwork when fintech wasn't even called fintech. It was all about prepaid back in the day when we're talking about card issuance. So, for me, it really is about being able to understand and acknowledge where we've been, where we are, and where we're going to. And that all wraps into the partnerships piece for me. Shana made a really interesting point on the pandemic and the acceleration of technological advance within that sort of stage. And I feel awful even suggesting for 1 minute that the pandemic's been a good thing. I'm not suggesting that. I mean, it's been a tragic thing across the globe. We all know that very, very well. But what it has forced is the hand in terms of technological advances. I think that has also then brought up another key consideration, which is we do have a digital divide. Financial inclusion remains a challenge, and supporting the underbanked or the underserved, the financially excluded, in my opinion, we still have a huge amount of work to do, albeit there remains a huge amount of very, very positive traction in the space. So I think it's like anything. Again, this loops into the partnerships piece for me, whereby on one hand, we really are driving and accelerating partnerships. On the other hand, as a result of all that focus, traction and energy and activity, there's also other areas that lend itself and identify themselves as needing continued focus, support and impetus behind them.
Shana, I know this is a topic that you're particularly passionate about in terms of financial inclusion. What are your thoughts on what Darren had to say just there?
I mean, I think he's just dead on. I don't really have much more to add. I think it just, like he said, and you can hear me hesitating even in my voice now, that COVID certainly has not been a good thing globally, but in just kind of leveling the playing fields and or showing that there is a need to kind of be able to reach everyone across the world at one time. It just made room for people to assess how they're working, made room for these partnerships to happen. It's made people more open because we are kind of all equal now. We're all working in homes with our different backgrounds, and it's just made us all to kind of go back to that point of being human and the value of that. I think it's just made these engagements not only richer, but just that much more possible.
And I think one thing to add as well, Greg, to all of this is we talk a lot about adoption and partnerships and fintech. And I think the reality of adoption and people becoming more aware and mainstream people becoming more aware of fintech and the role that fintech or techfin, depending on your preference, will play is going to be exponentially more than what any research papers suggest right now. I'll be fascinated to see in 12 months, 18 months, 24 months out, how many people truly are engaging with what we see as and it seems weird, traditional fintech players. It's anything but traditional, right? It's about challenge all the time and challenging those partnerships, challenging the status quo and challenging the propositions. But I'm fascinated to see what the future does hold, and long may it continue in terms of the financial technology sector.
I promise this is the last time I mention COVID, because I'm trying to make a conscious effort to not mention it and move on from it, at least personally. But Louis, perhaps I could ask you, how has the pandemic impacted TomatoPay? And to Darren and Shana's points, what do you see the future holding for us as a society and fintech in general when it comes to partnerships?
Well, I mean, for us, our target kind of customer is a non-digitized business owner, small business owner. And so who's doing everything with paper, doing everything manually. And so again, kind of the general trend of digital transformation from the big companies to, your corner store, who's doing everything by paper. I think everyone's seeking new solutions of how to run and manage their businesses in a more streamlined way, both from a competition perspective, but also just there are so many great tools out there that make it easier to run your business or manage your personal finances, whatever it might be. And so, for us, we've seen a huge uptick in interest in just trying something new. If it's going to save me money as a small business, if it's going to allow me to cut down 5 to 10 hours of manual admin work a week, then I'm more receptive to trying something new now than I might have been last year when I had the time, or there wasn't as much financial pressure for me to switch to something that's a pretty drastic departure from business as usual. So I think in that perspective, we've seen a big shift in both consumer behavior around payments, but also small businesses, how they're collecting revenue, and trying to make that as easy as possible, as contact-free as possible, to avoid COVID transmission. And we see QR codes as a big driver of that. But otherwise, I think the conversations I've been having with small business owners and consumers about how they make and receive payments, it's changed so much since COVID began. So I think it's going to continue to change.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's fair to say that the pandemic, amongst many other things, has accelerated the pace of behaviour change in so many ways. If we look at contactless as one of many examples, not wanting to tap a PIN pad and rather than just tapping your card has significantly accelerated that adoption. I've got two more questions, if I may. So looking at partnerships, again, coming back to one of the first questions that I asked, but just circling back on it, what partnerships would you highlight as some that we can really learn from? Perhaps ones that have either come up from the pandemic or ones before. But Darren, perhaps I could ask you that question first.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, again, there is such a wealth of partnerships that really have come to the fore. And I think, Shana, I can't remember if it was Shana or Louis made the point earlier on that not a day goes past when there's multiple partnership announcements, let alone one-offs. I think for me, partnerships is also, it's all about accessibility and driving and increasing connectivity. We talk a lot about this absolute, acceleration in this digitized age and the technological advances that come with that. But I'd argue that it's also, how many of us, just to go off on a bit of a tangent, but it does have synergy, how many of us would have been comfortable networking in a virtual environment 24 months ago, And that for me comes back to the point that you're asking, Greg, around, the evolution and birth of your proposition, Finder. Again, it's allowing people to create, to identify, and to collaborate in ways that previously we didn't do. So, I think to acknowledge and it's impossible for me just to pull out a couple of names as to where we've learned from. I think for me, it's more about the themes that we're learning from these partnerships, whether that's in the sector of travel, which might seem an odd one given the current climate, but nonetheless, it's a great time for those in that sector to start to perhaps formalize what the future looks like and what that recovery is starting to look like as the green shoots are starting to now come through. Or maybe it's in the world of FX or the neobanks or the challenger banks. We're seeing more and more. Louis talked about the ecosystem before and the importance of that ecosystem. And when I talk of that ecosystem, again, I'm heavily skewed to the issuance one, but whether that's issuers or BIN sponsors, or whether it's program managers, wallets, enablers, there's so many people that play a part in that potential value chain. For me, the real art and what brings the beauty to life is being able to identify and being close enough to your clients or your prospective clients to understand and help them inform what they need, i.e. they don't know what they don't know. So I hope that's answered the question. I've gone off a little bit, but hopefully there's some relevance and you can draw out some relevance to what I've shared there.
No, it's absolutely perfect. You broadened it out from fintech, which is what I was keen to do so. And I guess coming to Shana, this is a nice way to ask you the similar question. What partnerships have you seen that have emerged particularly positively or not that you would highlight, either in fintech or outside of fintech?
Sure, and that was really, really beautiful answer, Darren. Again, it's like just really, really nicely said. I completely agree with everything you said, and as someone kind of on the other side in the fintech space and a bit more in the weeds, so to speak, of what the day-to-day looks like, and partnering with these large organizations like like an organization, an enterprise of MasterCard size, or these tier 1 banks. I can speak a little bit to the run that we have currently with HSBC, and not only did COVID enable some of the needs within the financial crime compliance space to change. Unfortunately, even though we're all saying similar things about COVID and not being something that's we ever want to say is beneficial, in the financial crime compliance world, the demand for products like ours has also risen because of COVID, because now financial criminals are more online. Everyone's similar to how we're reading about new partnerships all the time. We're also seeing cases of cybercrime and fraud, and at just tremendous global scales just have been expedited by this move to online, and now these very savvy digital criminals. So I guess the high profile partnership I would talk about would be the one with Silent8 and HSBC. Again, not to be too self-promotional, but I'm in the weeds of it every day, so I just have the most credibility there to speak about it. And in that case, it was the bank needing to improve their manual processes, looking for a digital solution, and finding one over time with our solution. But it also was, us listening to them and what their needs were, and really, all of our solutions are custom based. So it's developing a solution that fit for them and their exact needs, and also leveraging their own institutional knowledge. We always say, we're the technology company, but the banking customer has this, tremendous wealth of institutional knowledge. They know best. And working together to create an AI that actually solves the problem they had, that is a problem across the space, across different industries right now, has led to a really, really beautiful partnership.
I mean, looking from the sidelines, the way that you've gone about creating and evolving and growing the partnership between Silent8 and HSBC has been quite remarkable for a whole set of reasons. I think that particular bank themselves, knowing them well as we all do, would admit that they're not always the first to innovate. So to take what you've created and partner with them in such an effective way has been very impressive to see. Perhaps, Louis, exactly the same question to you, if I may, and perhaps you may want to touch on your partnership with Santander, but what partnerships do you want to highlight as some that we could learn from?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the partnerships that stuck out to me for the last year was Amazon partnering with Fiserv in the US to enable voice command for pumping gas and paying for gasoline. And so, Amazon Pay is processing all the transactions, but anyone can go up to a pump at ExxonMobil gas stations and use a voice command to their Alexa powered vehicle to pump gas and then pay for it. And so I think this is a great example of taking kind of a daily activity and enhancing the customer journey by pairing a traditional non-financial services company, Amazon, with a Fiserv who kind of handles these large scale fintech integrations. And I think bringing two different types of technology together, the Amazon Alexa voice enabled with payments, and pairing that into a nice customer journey is a great partnership model to learn from, because it's still focused on serving the end customer. I think it's often easy to just build a partnership for the sake of building a partnership, or build a partnership with two companies who are looking at, what's the relative revenue pool for the two of us, not how can we best serve our respective customers, and then we'll both win from that. So I think starting with the customer and working backwards is a great way to think through these partnerships, and we can learn that from Amazon, the customer-centric company.
I think just building on that point, if I may, as well, Louis, and it's a really compelling point you make, but if we take that one stage further when we're talking about partnerships, I think this point is critical, which is there is no single organization that can expect to affect the change needed alone. We're only going to make, I say we, the royal we, we're only going to make these changes and effective changes happen by bringing together combined strengths to make that desired impact. I mean, that dovetails with MasterCard's overarching, sort of multi-rail strategy, where we're ultimately saying, look, we want to be plugged in across all of the services and all of the sectors, trying to address issues ultimately that are surrounding a fully interoperable world, serving, the consumer to provide the highest level of seamless convenience. Now, for me, that mantra or that overarching objective is relevant, whatever your business. I guess it's just to the extent of, multi-rail in MasterCard sense. What's your multi-rail?
You brought us on to the kind of the last question beautifully, which is around values and advice. And so let me start by asking Shana this question, this last question, if I may. What would your top tips be when it comes to creating partnerships? Kind of the do's and the don'ts, if you like, and you may want to touch on values as well.
Sure, and this is maybe a bit of a kind of just technical tip I would think about, but it's really just making sure that the right people, the right stakeholders are in the room. Again, living and breathing in the weeds of the fintech space, for us, it's making sure that the right stakeholders in the room, that that we've got the right IT people provisioned for us, because it's great to talk about these, and I kind of often start the conversation, but then it's a matter of really handing it over to the right people to make sure that it happens and that they're representing the separate business objectives for both parties, but ensuring that they're all at the table when these decisions are happening, when you're talking about the pain points and what you're looking for. That would be my first and kind of overarching tip, is just making sure you've assembled the right teams from both sides to be at the table, to listen to each other and have that initial conversation.
Thank you, Shana. That resonates. I mean, Darren, what are your thoughts on Shana's thoughts there?
Totally concur with all of those points. I think, where I perhaps go in addition is maybe look at it in a way of how can we build, before you've even started a partnership, I'd ask the question how a partnership can be improved, in terms of desired outcomes. And I'd maybe focus on, how responsive one is, agility, being able to listen and adapt at pace, being able to embrace change, and ultimately being a very, very good listener, and able to be, in addition to be able to provide guidance and some thought leadership, but also to being able to listen, to challenge, to assimilate, and to really bring in those right people at the right time that are going to add that meaningful, credible, additional value to that prospective client or partnership. That the whole piece around collaboration, clearly, I mean, that surely is, partnerships personified, if we like. But I think if I was to wrap all of those words into three things, I guess, for me, it's number one, thinking differently and being challenged to think very much outside of the box. It's no good. The marketplace is extremely crowded already, with numerous people who may or may not be seeming to offer the same thing. So being able to differentiate is clearly aligned to that point. No one size fits all. You've got to adapt to each scenario. And again, sure, as I mentioned earlier on, for me, working together and collaboratively is what's going to ultimately foster and find and identify the best solutions long term.
Thank you, Darren. That was beautifully put. Louis, perhaps you could close us off with parting words and your thoughts on what Darren just said there, and then finally your advice on to any business when it comes to creating partnerships. What would your top tips and guiding rules be?
I think it's a great point Darren made about knowing what you're getting into before you get into it. And that actually leads to, I think, my number one tip, which would be, really be disciplined with having a system to rank all opportunities. And you can do that along a bunch of different lines, qualitative and quantitative. You could, rank based on criteria around what's the joint value creation of this potential from this opportunity. How is the team and organization fit together? Will our teams align and be able to work through things? And then how do we slice the revenue pie? At the end, I think if you really take a disciplined approach and go one by one through all the different partnership opportunities you have, it forces you to really pick and choose and be in it for the right reasons. And then that way, you'll get quality over quantity. And I think it's, that can be applied across any industry really. It's just a matter of making sure you know why, what's your why with a partnership, and then how are you going to execute on it, and making sure that that vision has alignment in your own organization, but also in the partner organization as well. So that would be kind of tip number one. And following up on that, once you're in the partnership, the cliche of 1 + 1 = 3, but really it does. Where is the value being created, and for whom? And how do you work closely and manage your partnership in such a way that it's going to end up benefiting both of your companies, but ultimately the end customer or the end small business, whoever it is. So I think that's the key.
Louis, that's wonderful. Final words. Thank you. I think the sentiment of what you're talking about is that it has to be equitable for all, where there's value for everybody, and there's a common shared sense of trust and goals. Well, this is it's been fascinating talking to you all. Thank you so much for your time. Louis, Darren, Shana, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.